Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, October 16th, where we are thinking about writing paper number 1 and also moving forward with our readings with drama. So last class I had some reading scheduled that I didn't get a chance to get to about reading drama and the elements of drama. And for today's class, I have some reading scheduled about Sophocles, the author of our first drama, Oedipus the King. So I believe I can combine both of those together as you are hopefully contemplating what to do with your first paper. And in terms of reading drama, the good news is that in many ways it's similar to some of the ways that we've read short story. That said, there will be some differences. Dramas are obviously longer than short stories, and they will probably have more than just one incident. That's usually the definition of a short story, is that it talks about one incident. So we're reading fewer dramas, but we've got multiple classes devoted to each of the dramas. And you'll want to pay particular attention to the stage directions. Those are usually written in italics. And I can tell you right now, you probably would be tempted to skip them, but you don't want to skip them because these are the only clues you have from the playwright as to how the play should be performed. And plays are ultimately meant to be performed, not to be read. That said, we're reading these plays because they have so much depth and complexity to them that they require reading. If we were to just watch performance, we would miss a lot of the subtleties and a lot of the nuances. And ideally, we would watch these dramas live, but of course, the logistics of that just too difficult. So instead, we're going to watch recorded versions of these dramas. That is somewhat different than watching a live version, but the fact that this is a literature and film class, I think, lends itself very well to the idea of watching recorded versions of the plays. And we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about Citizen Kane and the multiple layers involved, from cinematography to director to lighting to actor, in addition to the actual written text. So all of those things are things that we will keep in mind when it comes to drama. You also, when you're reading a drama, want to pay particularly close attention to the character names and who is speaking and when. Again, oftentimes those are things that you might be likely to skip, and if you do, you will get very confused very quickly. You really need to slow down and identify who is talking and try to visualize what those characters look like and what they sound like and what they're wearing. It's one of the reasons why watching a performance is easier than reading, because ultimately when you are watching any kind of performance, all of these elements are given to you. And eventually it'll come time for us to write a paper about drama, and it'll be very similar to the kind of paper you wrote for a short story, where I will suggest that you could write about canon, or you could write about contemporary relevance, or you could create your own topic in approximately 4 to 5 pages, a critical paper, not using outside resources. And you would have the options of the 3 written dramas that we are going to be studying as literature, or the 3 performances of the dramas that we will be watching and talking about those in terms of performance and film. But, of course, we still haven't done our first paper yet. So my hope is that by the time we get to the second paper, you'll already have a good sense of how to write a paper of this nature. So you're basically duplicating what you did with short story, but with a different set of readings. And probably most of us haven't been to the theater very frequently, and maybe never even at all. But seeing a live performance is very different than seeing something that's recorded. There's a magic and there's an electricity there. I kind of liken it to watching a live concert as opposed to seeing it on film. Ironically, Taylor Swift's Eras Tour is now coming out on film, and I'm sure that it's a wonderful experience, but I'm also sure that it pales in comparison to actually seeing the performance live. Of course, seeing it on film allows you to see it multiple times. It makes it accessible to a larger group of people, and it's certainly much more affordable. So that said, it allows the message to be given to a greater number of individuals than live. But again, live is unpredictable. You'll never know exactly what could happen. I'll never forget, I saw a live production once on Broadway. I had terrific seats. So I was basically just about on the stage itself. So I was able to see a brief exchange between two actors that I doubt anybody could see in the rows behind me. It looked like I saw a sense of panic on both of their faces. It looked like somebody had dropped the line. Somebody had made an error with the script. These are two professional actors, so they covered up very quickly and all was well. But for that split second or two, I could see the exchange between them and something went wrong. It was obvious. At least, again, if you were close enough to see that something went wrong. Those are the things that you can never duplicate. And of course, the audience helps to influence the performance as well. So that said, the actors feed off of the audience feeds off the actors. Very similar to a classroom situation where a teacher feeds off of the students feed off of the teacher. That's why online classes are a little bit odd, in my opinion. But that said, they also provide a convenience and an accessibility that perhaps is not available with in-person classes. So that might be a comparison between drama and a performance live as opposed to recorded. The whole educational experience of face-to-face classes and online classes. So our most common probably experience with drama is through television and film, and it's particularly television. And I think about the heyday of television, which would have been in the 1990s. This is pre-internet. So there were very few, or fewer certainly, entertainment options that exist today. So TV really was the primary mode of entertainment, for better or for worse. One of the things that it did is it led to this kind of common understanding between large groups of people because we were all consuming the same media at the same time. And there was one television show that you might have heard of that was quite popular at the time. It was called Seinfeld. And in fact, in your textbook, you're given a brief piece of the script from Seinfeld. And the reason why they show it to you is to sort of illustrate the difference between reading something and actually watching it perform. Now, certainly, if you are a Seinfeld fan, then you have an advantage because you already know about the drama. It was a sitcom, and basically it was supposed to be about nothing. That was the hook, and that these hijinks and these misunderstandings that would occur would ultimately come to nothing and have some resolution at the ending of a half hour that included commercials. And if you've actually seen the episode that is in our textbook, or the portion of the episode that's in our textbook, the pitch, then you truly have an advantage. If you've never seen the show Seinfeld, or even if you've never even heard of the show Seinfeld, obviously you're going to have a much more difficult time understanding. And it's the same with the dramas, that if you have some knowledge of the drama, you've got an advantage. And each time you watch a performance of the drama, or each time you read a version of the drama, you're able to catch nuances that you couldn't catch. But just to illustrate the distinction between the two, I'm just going to read a few lines from that episode that is included in our textbook called The Pitch. And Stu says to Jerry, this is after we're told, these are the stage directions. The mood is jovial. Stu Schermack is there along with Susan Ross and Jake Crespi, Russell Dalrymple, the head of the network. And Stu to Jerry says, the bit I really like was where the parakeet flew into the mirror. Now that's funny. And George says, the parakeet in the mirror? That's a good one, Stu. Jerry says, yeah, it's one of my favorites. And Russell asks, what about you, George? Have you written anything we might know? And George wrote, well, possibly. I wrote an off-Broadway show, La Cocina. Actually, it was off-Broadway. It was a comedy about a Mexican chef. And it goes on and on. If you are interested, I found a clip of that. It's about 3 minutes long or so. It's in our notes below in section B. And watching what I just read, which was pretty dry and straightforward, actually performed is a huge world of difference. So, in terms of the elements of drama, expect, because dramas are longer, they will have divisions within them. one of those divisions are called acts. These are the main divisions of a play. And within those acts, you'll have scenes. These are divisions for establishing a new location or a new character. You also will probably have subplots. In addition to the main plot, there will be secondary plots, and they should all fit together. Of course, stage directions, as I was indicating to you, these are the playwright's instructions to the actors. A really talented playwright will write stage directions that are just as literary as the actual play itself. We will see that with our last play, Raisin in the Sun. And I could tell you what would be ideal now, but I understand the world isn't ideal. What would be ideal is that now that we are headed into Oedipus the King, that you are reading and are close to finishing Oedipus the King. So when we watch performance and we talk about the play, you have read the play in its entirety and you are reading the next play that we will be discussing eventually in class, which happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. And again, multiple classes devoted to Midsummer Night's Dream because of its length and because we have to watch performance. And what would be ideal is when we're talking about Midsummer Night's Dream, you're at home reading the last drama, which is Raisin in the Sun, so that when we begin to talk about it and watch it, you don't have to read Raisin in the Sun, and you can begin thinking about paper number 2, because by that point we would have been talking about, or we will be talking about paper number 2. So, but I understand that isn't ideal, and I also understand you're working on your first paper, so you try to get ahead as much as you can. The thing with the first drama that we are watching from 430 BC, very old drama, is that the audience would have known the plot ahead of time, and I'll explain why in a little bit. So we will know the plot ahead of time. So it's less about reading it for the plot, and it's more about reading it for the themes. And it's the same with watching performance as well, for at least this first drama. Expect a kind of pyramid structure in many dramas, and actually in most pieces of literature, that you have a rise of action and then a fall of action, so that it almost looks like a pyramid. And the tip of the pyramid, the point at the top, would be the height of conflict. We'll definitely see this in Shakespeare. Not all stories follow this formula. Think about Citizen Kane. It was much more circular, for instance, which made it much more complex. Now, the textbook includes on page 115 and 116 some questions about writing about drama. Some of these questions are very similar to the questions the text asked you to consider when you were writing about short story. So, for instance, what was your first response? Did you enjoy the drama or the play? Notice we use both words interchangeably, and there is this sense of playing when you're watching a drama. There's supposed to be enjoyment associated with it. What is the significance of the title? And we've been talking about that since the beginning of the semester, the importance of title. What information do the stage directions provide, as I had indicated earlier? How is the exposition or the background information revealed to us? How is the setting important? Is it used symbolically? What foreshadowing or hints or clues are we given as the play progresses for understanding the action at the end? And then, of course, we may not even understand that there's foreshadowing until we get to the ending of the play. Ideally, you would read a play 3 times. The first for plot, the second for analysis, and the third to refresh your memory before you write or read about it. Ideally, you would watch a performance 3 times for the same reasons. The first for plot, the second for analysis, and the third to remind yourself prior to, let's say, an assignment. But I understand that might not always be possible. But again, the more viewings and the more readings you've done, the more likely it is that you can grab all of the little details and nuances that you might have missed the first or even the 5th time around. What is the major conflict? Is the conflict resolved? And just like in real life, sometimes it's not. What are the subplots? What other stories are going on and how do they relate to the main plot? Who is the protagonist, the main character, and the antagonist, who's supposed to be the enemy? How does the playwright reveal information about characters? How do their names or physical qualities or actions or words convey things about them? What's the purpose of the minor characters? Do all the characters use the same kind of language? And if not, is the language appropriate for their characters? Does your response change over the course of the play? Are words and images repeated? How does the playwright's use of language contribute to the tone or the feeling of the play? Is it comedic? Is it tragic? Are there symbols used in the play? And if so, how and why? Question 18 is particularly important. Are there unfamiliar theatrical conventions used that present problems in understanding the play? You have to remember the plays were written for their times, not our times. And certainly the limitations of technology would have influenced how a story could or could not be told on stage. We will definitely see that with Oedipus the King, a play that was written in 430 BC. No electricity, for instance. So this is going to change everything in terms of performance. Performances that would occur outdoors so they could take advantage of the natural light. Is the theme directly stated? And as we know with literature, it probably won't be. How does the play reflect the values of its time and society? Because ultimately it was written for then, not for now. How does the play either reflect or challenge your own values? You don't have to agree with the messages in the play, but you need to be able to identify them. How would you produce that play on stage? Obviously, there's a lot of interpretation that goes on here in terms of acting and directing and so forth. Is there a particular critical approach? So would biographical information about the author be useful to understanding the play? Or historical information about the time period help you to understand the play? How do your own experiences, your values, your beliefs inform your own interpretations? What kinds of evidence are you focusing on or not focusing on? And keep in mind that we all bring our own biases and our own interests when we interpret something. In fact, they even give you a sample analysis of a very short play. Not all plays have to be long, called trifles, which means things that aren't very important. And this is a one-act play. It's so short, actually, that it was even turned into a short story in your textbook. So you could compare and contrast the differences with telling a story in play form as opposed to short story form. If nothing else, in short stories, it's fairly easy to let a reader know how a character is thinking because you can just simply write, he thought. It's not that easy on stage when we're actually watching dialogue be performed in the moment. Sometimes a character needs to express their thoughts out loud. Sometimes it needs to be part of the dialogue. Sometimes it's a voiceover, but it's not as simple as it would be if you're writing a story. I encourage you to read the one-act play Trifles. It's a great play. It happens to be an older play that is definitely talking about feminist issues when we have a series of law enforcement officials investigating the scene of a murder. They happen to bring along their wives with them. As they leave their wives to investigate the clues, the wives actually are able to put together the answer to the puzzle by looking at these little trifles, things that seem unimportant, and realize that this was a scene of domestic violence and that the wife had actually killed her husband because he had been abusing her. And then the women have to make the decision, do they tell the husbands what they've discovered? They decide they're not going to. So it's a moral question that if the woman had been abused, then perhaps it was best for them just to leave things be and not to necessarily volunteer any information. So it's a great play, albeit a very short play. And those aren't necessarily the plays that usually we read in a drama section. We usually read things that are much longer. And almost always it's the play Oedipus the King that is the play that is examined initially in drama. Again, a very old play, 430 BC from Athens, Greece. And you might wonder why we would spend time with this particular play. It really is important historically because it led to the tragic tradition that we think of today. Usually when we talk about Shakespeare, we talk about his tragedies. Histories, no. Comedies, no. Usually we talk about Hamlet and Macbeth and Othello. So there are criteria or rules for tragedies, and they were developed actually in Oedipus the King. And from that perspective, it's a very important play, even though we have to read a translation because obviously we wouldn't be reading it in the Greek. And as far as I'm concerned, as many translations as I've read of Oedipus, I've never really read Oedipus the King because I've never read it in the original. There are always complications associated with translations. You have to have a very skilled person who's translating. You have to make sure that they're able to translate plot. But also what's complex about Oedipus in particular was that it was written in poetry. And poetry is all about the sounds of words, the musicality of it. And of course, the sounds of words are different in different languages. So it's a balancing act of trying to keep to the plot, but also to keep to the sounds of the words. We will be watching a performance, which is also a different translation. And I can tell you right now, the performance that we're going to be watching is going to try to duplicate as much as possible what we would have experienced in 430 BC, which was a very different time. Again, with a lot of different limitations that we wouldn't experience today if this were being performed on stage. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Sophocles, who happens to be the author of Oedipus the King. He was a statesman, he was a general, he was a dramatist, and we have a handful of his plays intact, which include Oedipus the King. And luckily, Oedipus is the play that helped to establish the tragic tradition. And Oedipus is part of a trilogy. It's a 3-part story. We're reading only the first part, Oedipus. But there is a second part, Antigone, and a third part, Oedipus at Colonus. Antigone happens to be the story of Oedipus's daughter. We're introduced to Oedipus's daughter in the first play, Oedipus the King, but she's just a child. In the second play, she's an adult. On the third play, Oedipus at Colonus, we're introduced to Oedipus again, but at this point he's a young man, because in the first play we're reading, he's an old man, because in the first play that we're reading, he is a young man, but at Oedipus at Colonus, he's an old man. So we get to see the progression of his life. And all these 3 plays stand as independent units, but if you put them all together, they tell a larger story. I almost think about like the Star Wars saga, that they all stand independently. They were all written at different times, but if you put them together in chronological order, they tell a much grander story. Same sort of thing with Oedipus. One of the things that Sophocles did to help make drama more sophisticated was add a 3rd actor on stage. At the time, they would only have 2 actors on stage because it would be very difficult to see the actors. So if you added more actors, it would be very easy to mix the actors up and the characters up. Because, again, these theaters were meant for large groups of audience members. We're talking 14,000 people. They were much like stadiums. Greek amphitheaters were basically built into hillsides, in stone hillsides. And that said, if you were all the way in the back, you're not going to see the actors on stage. One of the reasons why it was important that the audience would know the plot ahead of time, so that they wouldn't have to watch the performance to be reliant on plot. They would watch it in order just to experience the event. I kind of liken it going to a religious service where you already know the biblical story, but you want to listen to the sermon nevertheless because each treatment will be different. And in fact, plays were seen as spiritual vehicles by the government at the time. They were even made for religious festivals to the gods. Keep in mind, this is Greece, so it was a story, or it was a society of gods in the plural, not just one god. And these plays helped to reinforce religious and community values. Hence, they were funded by the actual state themselves. And plays in particular were religious festivals to the god of wine and fertility, Dionysus. So those Greek amphitheaters, those rows of rising seats that were built into the hillside for over 14,000 people. I actually have a brief video for you to watch below to give you a sense of what the Greek amphitheaters were like. It's just a few minutes long, but you'll be able to see an amphitheater. They were marvels of acoustics, so they projected sound very well. But that said, it would still be difficult to hear. So some of the conventions that they used to help an audience see and hear. The actors would wear large padded costumes, so they would appear larger than life on stage. They would wear these huge masks so that you could differentiate one from another on stage. They would wear platform shoes. So again, that would give them height. It's thought there were amplification devices in the masks to help project their volume, to help ease audibility and volume. And there would be such a thing as known as a chorus. If you're familiar with Broadway musicals, perhaps you're familiar with the chorus. You have large groups of people singing in a Broadway musical. In this instance, the chorus for Greek tragedy, or just Greek plays in general, would be large groups of people chanting. In some ways, it would actually provide a kind of musical soundtrack. It would also provide the community's reflections on the action that was occurring so that they could serve as extras, if you will. Sometimes the chorus even served as a narrator commenting on the action. And one of the themes that you would expect to see were the issues of the negative consequences of hubris, excessive pride. So that oftentimes, again, one of the instructional elements of the play was not to engage in the same sins, the same flaws as the main character. And what we should feel as audience is something called catharsis, which means that we experience the emotion vicariously, but in a safe manner. Suppose that's some of the reason why people enjoy, let's say, roller coasters, is that you can have the adrenaline rush, but do it in a safe context. And what we should feel is pity and fear. Pity, because this is a tragedy. It's about horrible events. Fear, because it could happen to us. And this is in direct relation to Aristotle, a name that you might be familiar with, who was a philosopher at the time, but also a literary critic. He was the one who identified Oedipus as perhaps the finest example of tragedy that had ever been written to that point. And he laid out the definition of tragedy, that a tragedy should be complex. Makes sense. That's what we've talked about with literature. Literature should be complex. It should be terrible because it's tragic. It should be piteous. And in fact, Aristotle directly names Oedipus the king. That's a great example. And it should be about a great individual, somebody who is above and beyond the ordinary, someone that we respect and admire, who experiences a downfall, in part because of their flaw or flaws in character. So there are mistakes they make that we shouldn't make in our own lives. But there also are outside forces, things that cannot be controlled, whether you want to call this luck or fate or destiny. And then ultimately, because this is a good person, this person accepts responsibility for their part in their flaws and for their fall. And as audience, again, we feel pity because this was a good man, so it wasn't completely their fault. And we also feel fear because if they could experience such a horrible tragedy, and they're better than we are, then we could experience something comparable or even worse. So those are the elements that we could expect to see in a play such as Oedipus the King. And I gave you, as you can see in the notes below, a brief reading from Aristotle entitled On Tragic Character that talks a little bit about some of the criteria for a tragic hero and tragic character. And again, we're reading a translation. Obviously, we're not reading from the original Greek. One other convention at the time, Deus Ex Machina, that you might have heard of before, God in the Machine. At the time, what it meant was a series of pulleys and ropes that would lower characters onto the stage through some, again, we would suspend disbelief and assume there was some sort of supernatural element at play. Or it could be the opposite, that it could raise a character up into the heavens. What has come to mean now in contemporary times is that this is any kind of artificial way to give a story or resolution. So for instance, after you've experienced an entire story and then after the fact you find out that it was all a dream, that would be a good example of Deus Ex Machina. So that said, thinking about another reason why Oedipus the King is so important is because of Sigmund Freud. And if you're taking psychology, you probably know Sigmund Freud, considered to be the father of psychology. And although his theories have fallen out of favor, he still is really the first person to help make psychology into a kind of academic discipline. Well, Sigmund Freud was inspired by the play Oedipus the King to create one of his theories and name it after the play. And the theory is called the Oedipal complex. And you might have heard of this theory before. And the theory, and it's very loosely based on the play, as you will see when you read the play, but the theory of the Oedipal complex, according to Freud, is that all young boys see their basically fathers as competition for their mothers, and have hostility for their fathers. And there's another theory called Electra complex, also from literature, for girls, where Freud would say that all girls would see basically their mothers as competition for their father's affections. This isn't exactly what happens in Oedipus the King, but it's close enough so that Freud could have been inspired by it. And as Sophocles had said, the characters need to be necessary in the play and probable, that they would act in a way that one would assume they would act, assuming that the situation was to occur in the way that it is detailed in the play. So, for instance, if you have somebody who's very undependable, then they should be very undependable throughout the entire play. So they should be dependably undependable, if that makes any kind of sense. So as I had indicated, the audience would have already known the plots of Oedipus the King. So I'm going to briefly tell you the plot and then let you know that what we're going to do is next class, I'm going to talk a little bit about documentation for papers and then give you the rest of the class to work on paper number 1, which is going to be due around the 23rd or so. The 23rd would be the midpoint of the semester approximately on Monday. And of course, early papers encouraged. That said, after the 23rd, I'm beginning to feel a little bit anxious because we've gone more than the midpoint of the semester. So you'll want to let me know what's going on there. In terms of thinking about the plot for Oedipus the King, and again, your textbook will give you this plot as well. And luckily, I was able to find a link for the play Oedipus the King. It's a different translation than the translation you have in your book, but each translation we read would be different. This one is from MIT, actually, the translation I was able to find online. But the story of Oedipus the King, it begins in what's known as media res, in the middle. And Oedipus, well, he's a king. And his country is savaged by plague. And he is trying to find the reasons why. And the assumption is that somehow the society has offended the gods. Remember, this is a society of gods. So, therefore, if they could find the reason why they offended the gods and make retribution, then ultimately they could find a way to appease the gods' anger. So, that said, Oedipus sends out a whole bunch of individuals to try to find out what exactly they've done to anger the gods, so that they can find a way to appease the gods. And what the answer is continually is that Oedipus himself is the one who's responsible. Oedipus sends out all kinds of messengers to oracles. Oracles were very common at the time. And basically, even Oedipus's own brother-in-law, who Oedipus sends out, comes back with the same message, that Oedipus is responsible. Oedipus doesn't believe it. He has a fit of anger and paranoia. He's convinced people trying to steal his kingdom from him, so forth and so on. As the story unfolds, we find out that Oedipus is indeed responsible. And this is where we get a whole lot of backstory. And this is the backstory. And it begins with Oedipus's birth parents. That when Oedipus was a baby, they went to the oracle to find out what his future would be. And the oracle told Oedipus's birth parents that their child would grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. Parents are horrified, decide they have to prevent this from coming true. So they give the baby to one of their servants. Parents are kings and queens, or a king and a queen, and instruct the servant to kill the baby. But the servant feels pity on the baby and instead abandons the baby, letting basically fate take over. And the baby is found by a shepherd and taken to another kingdom, a kingdom with a king and a queen who can't have children, it turns out. So they're thrilled to be presented with this baby, and they raise it as their own and never tell the baby that the baby was adopted. So the baby grows up into a man, and that man is Oedipus, and he believes that his adopted parents are his birth parents. And Oedipus, as a man, goes to an oracle to find out his future, which was pretty common at the time. And Oedipus is given a horrible prophecy that he's going to eventually kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus is horrified. He decides he'll do everything in his power to prevent it. So he decides to leave home, to put as much physical distance between himself and his parents. But what Oedipus doesn't know is that the people he thinks are his parents are his adopted, not his biological parents. On Oedipus's travels, there's someone who's blocking his way on a crossroads. Oedipus becomes so angry and irate that he kills all of the people in the carriage, and that includes, little did he know at the time, Oedipus's biological father. Or as a student of mine once said many years ago, perhaps this is the first literary example of road rage. And maybe we can explain why Oedipus reacted the way he did. Not that that's any justification, but nevertheless, eventually Oedipus makes it to a kingdom that's just recently lost their king, by the way. And in the kingdom, they're being ravaged by plague. And it turns out their plague is because of a monster named the Sphinx. And the way to end the plague is to solve the Sphinx's riddle. There's an old literary tradition here that the way you defeat monsters is by solving riddles. No one is able to solve the Sphinx's riddle, except Oedipus, because he is so much smarter than everybody else. The riddle, by the way, happens to be what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening. The answer happens to be man, by the way. 4 legs in the morning representing the beginning of life. This would be crawling as a baby. 2 legs in the afternoon height of life. That would be adulthood, walking upright. 3 legs in the evening would be old age, and that's walking with a cane. So at any rate, Oedipus solves the riddle and saves the community. Because the king was recently killed, Oedipus is rewarded with the kingdom. So now Oedipus becomes the new king, and that means that he also gets the newly widowed queen. And guess what? That newly widowed queen, Jocasta, turns out to be Oedipus's biological mother. Not that Oedipus or Jocasta ever knew this. And they have children together, which is what angers the gods, even though they didn't do so deliberately. Ultimately, the gods want to punish the community, which they do by ravaging plague on them. And once Oedipus is able to figure this out, he's devastated. So is Jocasta, Oedipus's wife/mother. In fact, she's so devastated that she commits suicide. Oedipus instead gouges out his eyes instead of committing suicide because his eyes have betrayed him. Throughout the play, he had vision but no insight. And the theme of vision and blindness, major theme in the play. In fact, one of the oracles Oedipus consults happens to be physically blind, but he has insight. Now Oedipus is much like that oracle. An irony of irony, Oedipus's brother-in-law, and Oedipus had accused his brother-in-law of trying to steal the kingdom from Oedipus. And the brother-in-law said, no, why would I want to do that? I have the best of both worlds. I have all of the perks of being part of the royal family and none of the responsibilities. Oedipus's brother-in-law is now ruling the kingdom, and he shows Oedipus a little bit of mercy and allows Oedipus to say goodbye to his children/sisters. And then Oedipus wanders off in exile because he's been exiled from the community. And because Oedipus is blind, it just so happens that he's walking with a cane. So Oedipus has fulfilled his own prophecy, not because he's an old man, but because he's a blind man. So he's walking on 3 legs. So he fulfilled the prophecy that he fulfilled his riddle, I should say, not prophecy. He fulfilled the riddle of the Sphinx. And the next piece of this trilogy would be the story of Antigone, one of Oedipus's daughters, who turns into an adult. And we again revisit Creon, who is still king, Creon being the brother-in-law. And then in the last piece, Oedipus at Colonus, we revisit Oedipus as an old man still wandering around with his cane. And we see whether or not he has received forgiveness from the gods. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what Oedipus the King is about. You can see, obviously, why it's a tragedy. And again, we'll talk more about the play, watch a performance of the play in the future. But next class, what I wanted to do was to revisit paper number 1, since we're getting a little bit closer to the midpoint of the semester. I'll talk about documentation, and I'll leave you some class time to work on the paper. And then the class after that, we can watch Oedipus the King. Today's attendance question is just continuing on with the theme of paper number 1. This will be due on our discussion forum by Wednesday. And that said, what issues, if any, are you encountering with paper number 1? What issues, if any, are you encountering with paper number 1? And again, if you're not encountering any issues, you can say none, and that would be fine. But I'm hopeful at this point that you are in the midst of writing paper number 1. And when you're taking breaks, you're beginning to read Oedipus the King. Not for plot, everybody would know the plot, but for some of the themes and the universal issues, such as fate and free will and destiny, which we'll talk about further. So, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about paper number 1. Take care. Bye-bye.